In modern warfare, standing up in front of machine guns is not bravery. It is a guaranteed way to die. Every doctrine agrees on this point. Every statistic reinforces it. And yet, in late spring of 1944, an American infantry company found itself trapped in a situation where the only action that could possibly save them was the one thing warfare forbids. The ground ahead was perfectly open. Hundreds of yards of reclaimed farmland with no trees, no buildings, no folds deep enough to conceal a moving man. Two German MG-42 machine gun positions dominated the field, placed deliberately to overlap their fire and turn empty space into a weapon. Their purpose was not accuracy, but control. Anyone who moved would be seen. Anyone who was seen would be engaged. Anyone engaged would almost certainly be hit. When Company B attempted to advance, the system worked exactly as designed. Fire snapped across the field, men went to ground, and the attack froze in place. Staying down felt safer, but it was an illusion. German artillery observers had clear visibility, and time was already shifting the odds against the attackers. The longer they remained pinned, the more precise the fire would become. This created the paradox that defined the battlefield. Movement meant near certain death, but immobility meant eventual annihilation. There were no flanks to turn, no smoke thick enough to matter, no supporting armor that could cross the soft ground fast enough. Doctrine had no answer for this configuration. The battlefield had reduced leadership to a single impossible calculation. Two machine guns blocked the advance. Remove one, and the geometry collapses. Remove neither, and everyone in the field dies. According to every rule of modern war, the next step should not exist. And yet, that was the step this battlefield demanded. The trap at Anzio did not exist by accident. It was the product of months of failure, hesitation, and time given freely to the defender. When Allied forces landed on the beaches in January of 1944, they expected speed to be their shield. The landing itself was almost unopposed. The opportunity was real. A rapid push inland could have unhinged the entire German defensive system in Italy and opened the road to Rome. But speed was not chosen. Caution was. While Allied commanders consolidated the beachhead, German commanders reacted with ruthless efficiency. Within days, artillery was brought forward. Infantry divisions were rushed in. High ground was occupied. Observation posts were established. The beachhead was slowly encircled, not by walls, but by mathematics, firepower, angles, and time. By the time the offensive resumed in late May, Anzio was no longer a breakout point. It was a pressure cooker. The land surrounding the beachhead offered every advantage to the defense. Mussolini's pre-war land reclamation projects had drained the Pontine marshes, turning swamps into farmland. On a map, it looked productive. On a battlefield, it was lethal. Flat terrain extended in every direction, broken only by shallow drainage canals and low rises barely perceptible to the eye. Those slight rises were enough. German engineers and infantry turned them into firing platforms. Machine guns were emplaced, not to defend a point, but to dominate space. Fields of fire were measured, overlapped, rehearsed. Artillery coordinates were pre-registered. Nothing was left to chance. For the attacking infantry, this meant there was no safe moment. Daylight meant exposure. Darkness meant disorientation and counterattack. Digging in offered temporary protection, but it also fixed units in place, allowing enemy gunners to refine their aim. This was siege warfare without walls, where the ground itself acted as confinement. Every advance cost blood. Every pause cost more. When the May offensive finally began, it did so under crushing weight. Thousands of guns fired in preparation, but artillery could not erase geometry. As soon as the infantry moved forward, the old reality returned. Machine guns survived. Lines of sight reopened. The kill zones reappeared. Entire units were pinned in minutes. Losses mounted not because of mistakes, but because the terrain rewarded the defender with perfect information. In this environment, leadership faced a brutal truth. No amount of coordination, bravery, or discipline could change the fact that the system favored the guns. Orders alone could not move men across open ground that punished movement with immediate violence. This was the deeper danger of Anzio. Not that soldiers would break and run, but that they would be trapped in place, slowly consumed by a battlefield that offered no solution within the rules it enforced. The situation demanded a breach. But every standard method of creating one had already failed. The question was no longer how to advance correctly. It was whether survival required doing something that modern war itself had declared impossible. By the second day of the breakout attempt, the problem had been reduced to its simplest form. 2 machine guns controlled everything. They were not hidden in bunkers or buried deep underground. They did not need to be. Their strength came from placement. Set far enough apart to avoid being silenced together, close enough to overlap their fields of fire, they turned an empty wheat field into a mathematical certainty. Anyone who stood up would be engaged by at least 1 gun. Anyone who tried to sprint would be visible for long enough to be hit multiple times. This was not a matter of courage. It was a matter of time under fire. Seconds accumulated. Probability converged. The outcome was predictable. The company lay pinned in shallow scrapes, unable to move forward, unable to retreat, and slowly losing men to random bursts and fragments. At this stage, command options collapse. There is no clever maneuver when space offers no concealment. Smoke drifts and thins. Suppressive fire reveals positions without neutralizing the threat. Artillery risks friendly casualties in terrain this flat. Armor cannot cross the soft ground fast enough to matter. The system has reached equilibrium, and that equilibrium favors the defender. This is the moment where doctrine ends and judgment begins. Someone had to reach the first machine gun position, not with a squad, which would draw too much fire, but alone, fast enough to exploit the brief hesitation that occurs when gunners shift targets. The idea was irrational by the standards of survival. A single man, crossing open ground, under sustained fire, was not expected to succeed. But success was not the point. Disruption was. The entire defensive setup depended on predictable behavior. Men staying down, squads moving together, assaults occurring in waves. A lone figure doing the unexpected forced a human reaction inside a system designed for mass. If one gun could be silenced, even briefly, the geometry would change. Fire would narrow, angles would collapse, the company could move. This was not heroism in the abstract. It was problem-solving under fire, where the only remaining variable that could be manipulated was the enemy's expectation. The battlefield had stripped away every safe option. What remained was a choice between certain loss and a calculated attempt to break the system by feeding it something it was never built to handle. A single man acting out of pattern. The moment the decision was made, the battlefield changed character. Until then, everything had been static, governed by distance and angles. Once a single man rose and moved forward alone, the system was forced to react. Machine guns are designed to control groups, to suppress formations, to punish coordinated movement. They rely on expectation. When that expectation is violated, even briefly, human operators must recalibrate. Fire has to shift. Priorities have to be reassessed. For a few seconds, certainty gives way to confusion. That window was all that existed. As the lone figure moved across the open ground, fire did what it was supposed to do. Bursts tore through the field. Impacts knocked him down. By every rational measure, the attempt should have ended there. But when he stood up again, something subtle broke on the other side of the guns. A target that does not stay down contradicts training. A target that keeps advancing after being hit challenges instinct. The gunners were no longer just suppressing space. They were tracking a problem that refused to resolve. Each time he rose, the calculation reset. Seconds were lost. Bursts shifted. Attention narrowed. The machine gun nest became focused on a single anomaly instead of the entire field. That focus was the crack in the system. Distance closed, the balance of power inverted. At long range, the machine gun dominates. At close range, it becomes vulnerable, slow to traverse, dependent on crew coordination. When the advancing figure crossed into that inner zone, the weapon's advantage collapsed faster than doctrine predicts. Fear compounded the effect. Not fear of death, but fear of the inexplicable. A bloodied man, visibly wounded, still moving forward, violates the assumptions that keep soldiers functional under stress. The decision to surrender did not come from weakness. It came from the sudden realization that the situation no longer obeyed the rules the defenders trusted. One position went silent. In purely tactical terms, it was a small event, but its impact was immediate. With one gun neutralized, the geometry changed exactly as expected. Fire thinned. Angles opened. The field was no longer a perfect trap. What followed was not a miracle. It was momentum. Men who had been pinned now saw a path. The company surged forward, exploiting the brief collapse before the system could reassert itself. The battlefield did not change because bravery prevailed. It changed because a structure built on predictability was forced to confront something it could not process fast enough. The collapse, however, was incomplete. Systems rarely fail all at once. The second machine gun position still stood, farther back, watching the same ground, adjusting to the sudden loss of its partner. From its perspective, nothing had changed except the inputs. One gun was silent. Movement was increasing. The solution was obvious. Reassert control. Fire resumed, sweeping the field again, attempting to restore the geometry that had just been broken. But the system was already destabilized. The company was no longer frozen. Men were moving, advancing in short rushes, no longer waiting for permission from probability. At the center of that motion was the same wounded figure, no longer running, but moving forward through sheer momentum. By now, the calculation had shifted. This was no longer about survival. It was about completion. The second position represented the final barrier between paralysis and breakthrough. Logic said the attempt should end here. Injuries compounded, blood loss slowed movement, distance closed too slowly to matter. And yet, the act of continuing carried its own force. The defenders fired, but they were no longer firing into stillness. They were firing into motion that had already broken expectation once. When the wounded man finally fell for the last time, the effect was not demoralization. It was ignition. What the system had tried and failed to erase had already done its work. The company did not stop to assess losses. They charged. With one position gone and the other disrupted, the second machine gun was overrun in seconds. The defensive line fractured, not because its weapons were inferior, but because its timing had been destroyed. The breakthrough that followed was not dramatic on a map. It was a narrow opening, measured in yards. But it was enough. Once the line cracked, it could not be resealed under pressure. The larger offensive surged through, linking forces, ending months of siege. From a distance, the outcome looks inevitable. From inside the field, it hinged on a single moment where a system designed to kill was forced to confront an action it could not resolve quickly enough. What happened on that field does not fit cleanly into any manual, and that is exactly why military historians keep returning to it. Modern warfare is built on prediction. Training exists to reduce uncertainty. Weapons exist to compress time, distance, and human hesitation into repeatable outcomes. Doctrine assumes that when conditions are properly shaped, overlapping fire, open ground, pre-registered artillery, the result becomes almost mechanical. At Anzio, that system did not malfunction. It functioned exactly as designed, and yet it still failed. Not because the technology was flawed, but because the system quietly assumes one thing that is rarely stated out loud: that no individual will willingly step outside the boundaries of survivable behavior. The entire structure of modern combat depends on that assumption holding true. When it does not, the math begins to break down. This is the deeper reason the story endures. Because of bravery, and not even because of sacrifice, but because it exposes a blind spot. The German defensive positions were optimized to handle squads, platoons, coordinated advances, suppressive fire, and predictable reactions. They were not optimized to handle a single human being who refused to behave like a rational variable. Once that assumption collapsed, every subsequent decision on the battlefield became reactive rather than controlling. Fire shifted. Attention narrowed. Timing slipped. In war, timing is everything. A few seconds lost at the wrong moment can undo months of preparation. That is what happened here. The system did not lose because it lacked firepower. It lost because it could not process an input it had never been designed to receive. It is important to understand what this does not mean. It does not mean that individual heroism is a substitute for planning. It does not mean that suicidal charges are effective tactics. Armies learned nothing replicable from this event, and they never intended to. Doctrine cannot be built around acts that require near-certain death. What the event demonstrates instead is the boundary condition of doctrine itself. Every system, no matter how refined, contains assumptions about human behavior. When those assumptions fail, even briefly, the system becomes fragile. The action at Anzio did not create a new rule. It revealed where the old rules stop working. This is why similar stories appear across wars, across eras, across technologies. Different uniforms, different weapons, the same pattern. A situation becomes tactically impossible. Every acceptable option leads to collapse. At that point, the system demands a cost it cannot distribute evenly. Someone absorbs it alone, not because they are reckless, but because the alternative is collective destruction. From the outside, this looks like heroism. From inside the decision, it looks like arithmetic. One life weighed against many. One certainty chosen to avoid a larger certainty. The moral weight of that choice is immense, but the logic behind it is cold. The uncomfortable implication is that modern war, despite its language of efficiency and control, still relies on moments that cannot be engineered. Militaries prefer to emphasize planning, coordination, and technology because those elements are teachable and repeatable. They are safe to institutionalize. Decisions like the one made at Anzio are not. They cannot be ordered. They cannot be expected. They cannot be written into doctrine without hollowing that doctrine of meaning. And yet, when systems reach their breaking point, they continue to rely on the possibility that someone, somewhere, will act outside the model. This tension sits at the heart of military history. On one side is the desire to remove the individual from risk through structure and process. On the other is the reality that no structure can anticipate every configuration of terrain, timing, and enemy behavior. When those gaps appear, the burden shifts downward, onto individuals who must choose between catastrophic outcomes. The story is remembered not because it offers guidance, but because it offers clarity. It shows what happens when every safe option is exhausted. That is also why these actions rarely change doctrine. Institutions learn from patterns, not outliers. One act, no matter how decisive, cannot outweigh hundreds of engagements where similar behavior would have resulted in pointless loss. Militaries cannot afford to design around miracles, but they also cannot deny that their success sometimes depends on them. This contradiction is never resolved. It is managed, obscured, and occasionally acknowledged through medals, citations, and memorials. Those recognitions are not rewards in the usual sense. They are admissions that the system required something it could not provide itself. When viewed this way, the charge at Anzio becomes less a story about death and more a story about limits. The limit of prediction, the limit of control, the limit of what machines, formations, and probabilities can guarantee. At the edge of those limits, outcomes revert to something older and harder to quantify. Human choice under irreversible pressure. Not choice as freedom, but choice as constraint. A decision made because everything else has already failed. Why this story continues to resonate beyond its tactical context. It forces a question that modern warfare, and modern societies more broadly, prefer to avoid. If systems are designed to minimize individual exposure to catastrophic risk, why do they still depend on individuals to absorb it when the systems themselves break down? The answer is not flattering, but it is honest. No system can fully eliminate the need for human judgment, and no amount of optimization can remove the possibility of situations where the cost must be paid in full by someone willing to accept it. In the end, the battlefield at Anzio did not reward courage. It demanded resolution. It did not respond to emotion. It responded to disruption. And it was disrupted not by superior firepower or clever maneuver, but by a decision that lay beyond what the system could calculate. That is the lesson that remains. Not a tactic to be copied, but a reminder that even in wars governed by numbers, outcomes can still hinge on a single moment where a human being steps outside the equation and forces the equation to fail.